It's a dreary afternoon, with rain pattering against the office windows. In a small building on a quiet street, three people are huddled around a table, tension thick in the air. A young woman sits in the middle, tears streaming down her face. Professor Bennett, an elderly man with gentle eyes, is next to her, offering comforting words in a soft but steady voice. Across from them, Professor Seo is visibly agitated. He's leaning forward, his hands balled into fists on the table. He cuts off Professor Bennett mid-sentence, his voice sharp and defensive. The topic at hand is explosive. The young woman has accused Professor Seo of having a romantic relationship with her, something he vehemently denies. The atmosphere in the room is electric with unease. Professor Han, who's been silent until now, tries to chime in with some background information, but Professor Seo, laser-focused on the accusation, doesn't let him get a word in. He's determined to address the allegation head-on, his eyes flashing with anger, and his voice trembling with barely contained frustration. The young woman, still crying, suddenly speaks up. She tearfully admits she misunderstood and let her feelings get confused. Professor Han then asks her a serious question. Had Professor Seo ever given her a reason to think their relationship was more than professional? Her tearful silence says everything. Frustrated, Professor Seo stands up quickly. He announces that he is leaving because he doesn't want to deal with what he calls unnecessary drama. Even though Professor Han asks him to stay and find a fair solution, Professor Seo insists on leaving and says he wants nothing more to do with the woman. As Professor Seo leaves, his final words hang heavy in the air. The young woman is left alone with Professor Han. She listens as he promises to guide her and have a private talk to help her deal with what happened. Outside, the rain keeps falling, adding to the gloomy mood. The tension in the office remains unresolved, showing how complex human relationships can be. Professor Han sits quietly for a moment, letting the woman collect her thoughts. He reassures her that they will find a way to move forward. He also stresses the importance of understanding and respecting boundaries. The girl keeps crying quietly. The old professor lets out a sigh of relief, thinking the young man is cold-hearted, but he's not surprised by his anger. Still, he's glad the young man isn't making things worse. He turns to him as he leaves and says he's free to go. He also mentions they need to find him a new teaching assistant, knowing he must have a lot of work. The old man assures him he'll find someone this time. He asks the young man what kind of person he needs. The young man is taken aback by this, wanting to make sure the old professor will really do it. The old professor confirms he will and asks for the specific qualities the young man wants. The young man says he doesn't have a strict list, only insisting the assistant shouldn't be a woman. He says this firmly and then closes the door behind him, leaving the old professor and the crying lady alone in the room. The scene shifts to a rainy street. A young woman walks with an umbrella, talking on her phone. She tells the person she's almost there and hangs up when she reaches a door. It's Professor Han's office. She looks around, impressed by the big College of Natural Sciences building. She can't believe she climbed all those stairs. She wonders if being here will fix all her problems, like people say. Lost in thought, she tries to close her umbrella but accidentally bumps into Professor Seo, rushing out. She quickly says sorry, and he tells her it's okay. He gives her a gentle pat on the shoulder and walks away. She watches him leave and lets out a sigh. She walks up to Professor Han's office to meet him, but his secretary asks her to wait outside because he's busy. She decides to take a stroll around the college instead. Walking through the corridors, she admires the campus, imagining students in white lab coats conducting experiments behind closed doors. She stops by a notice board, reading the announcements and information posted there. Suddenly, someone calls her name. It's Professor Han. He asks what she's doing there. Surprised, she turns around and addresses him formally with his title. He chuckles and tells her to just call him Uncle Han. He jokes that it took her long enough to visit after all his begging. He mentions the College of Liberal Arts is nearby. She apologizes for the delay, but he teases her back, saying he's the one who asked her to come and then made her wait. He glances at the notice board and asks what caught her attention. As the dean, he's curious if there's something important he missed. He scans the board but only spots an ad for a teaching assistant in the chemistry department, which surprises him. It should have been taken down by now. He mentions that if Professor Seo had found someone, he would have informed him. She asks if he's looking for a teaching assistant. He says it's complicated because of Professor Seo. He wonders if Seo really sees assistants as just helpers, or more than that. She asks who they're talking about, and he says it's Seo Jihyeok, a professor in their department. He describes Seo as cold, picky, and robotic in how he acts. The dean jokes that he's not sure if he'll find a replacement before he retires, secretly thinking it's Seo's loss. He advises her not to worry about him and suggests focusing on positive things and good food. Grateful for his kindness, she nods. Glancing at the time, he suggests leaving before the rain worsens. He asks if she's craving anything, but she replies no. Curious because it's unusual for her not to have a preference, he encourages her to share what's on her mind. Looking at the teaching assistant ad again, she hesitates before finally admitting there's something she wants to do. The next day, Professor Seo confidently walks into a big building on campus. He goes up to the receptionist and asks where the Hankook University Department of Chemistry reception is. She points down a hallway full of students rushing around and papers on the floor. Seo grumbles to himself about the mess as he walks through. He finally finds the elevator and steps inside with a sigh of relief, enjoying the sudden quiet after the noisy hallway. But just as he settles in, he's surprised to see Heemin already there. He hadn't noticed her at first, lost in his thoughts about the day ahead. She smiles politely as they ride up together. He selects the 12th floor, and they ride in silence. He wonders why such a young girl would be attending a gathering for professors. She seems so quiet, almost as if she's not really there. They reach their floor, and he hurries out of the elevator. He's so focused on where he's going that he isn't sure if she's followed him out. Heading towards the meeting room, he's greeted by Professor Han at the entrance. Han asks why he's just arriving and mentions he's been waiting for him. This catches Seo off guard. He figures if Han is so eager to see him, there must be a reason. Han grabs his hand and asks why he looks so serious, joking that it hurts his feelings. Seo replies that he's just recalling their last hand-holding incident. Han chuckles, remarking on Seo's good memory. He introduces Seo to two people he doesn't know, Ms. An and Miss Kim. Seo nods absent-mindedly, eager to find a seat. Seo tells Han he's met most of the people in the room and suggests they sit down. But Han interrupts, saying he hasn't met the most important person yet. Just then, Heemin walks in. Seo recognizes her as the quiet girl from the elevator. He wonders how she managed to sneak in so quietly. Quickly refocusing, Seo asks if he heard correctly, that Heemin is going to be his teaching assistant. Han confirms it, saying he acted on what Seo mentioned earlier. Seo isn't pleased. He had a bad feeling about Han's enthusiasm. Taking Han aside, Seo asks what's going on. He explains he knows Heemin well and lists her good qualities. Despite her being a humanities major, he's confident she can handle the role. Since Seo had previously said he doesn't care about qualifications, though he did insist on not having a woman, Han suggests they take a seat for now. They walk over to the men's table, while Heemin goes to the ladies' table. At the table, one of the women strikes up a conversation with Heemin. She mentions they've met before, and brings up what she's heard about Heemin being an anthropologist. Heemin nods, confirming it's true. The woman asks why she applied for the teaching assistant position in their department, noting it's unusual. She wonders if Professor Han recommended her and why she chose this place specifically. Before Heemin can respond, Ms. Kim interrupts sharply. She accuses Professor Han of overstepping boundaries by knowing Professor Seo's preference against female assistants. She argues that if more candidates had applied, Heemin wouldn't have been considered. The other woman tries to interject, advising Kim not to speak that way in front of a newcomer, but Kim persists. She insists she's speaking the truth and defends her stance, siding with the professor. Throughout this exchange, Heemin remains quiet, listening attentively. Kim continues, emphasizing the challenges of the teaching assistant role in a difficult major like anthropology, suggesting it requires specific skills only those in the field possess. The other woman tries to calm Kim down again, but Kim ignores her, adamant in her opinion. Finally, Kim stands up in frustration and anger, Disregarding the protests of the other women, she leaves the table defiantly, leaving a tense atmosphere behind. Miss Lim explains that her behavior stems from her desire to work closely with Professor Seo, despite not getting the opportunity. She assures Heemin not to worry, attributing it to Professor Seo's popularity. She wonders silently how long Heemin will manage in the job. Turning to Heemin, Ms. Lim asks for advice on navigating working with Professor Seo. She emphasizes one key point: to remember that Professor Seo's demeanor matches his appearance. She gestures towards him sitting there, quiet and aloof, suggesting Heemin should think of him not as a person but as a statue. At the professor's table, Professor Shin jokes with Professor Seo, telling him to lighten up and not act like something terrible just happened. Seo glances at him, a bit uneasy, but Shin quickly reassures him he's only kidding. Another professor chimes in, suggesting Seo might have been hurt by many women, prompting a discussion about why he prefers not to have a pretty teaching assistant. Seo feels uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Professor Shin then turns to Professor Han and jokingly asks if Heemin is his daughter, knowing Han only has a son. Han avoids a direct answer, calling them all nosy. He changes the subject, asking if anyone wants more to drink, and they all agree happily. They enjoy their wine together. Turning back to Professor Seo, Professor Shin asks if he wants to learn more about Heemin. Seo declines, saying it's fine. But Shin continues, sharing a few details about her, how she's hardworking. He presses Seo, asking if he's sure there's nothing else he wants to know. Seo insists he's not curious about anything else, feeling he has all the information he needs. Professor Han is surprised by Seo's response and asks what Seo already knows about Heemin. Seo explains that as long as she matches the description given, there shouldn't be any issues. However, he adds that if she turns out to be different, he'll handle it accordingly to maintain credibility. It's evening, and they're still at the gathering. Dinner is over, and now they've moved on to karaoke, which Professor Seo finds a bit unusual. He sits quietly by himself on one side of the room. On the other side, Heemin sits with her friend. Her friend encourages her to drink more, saying it's like a welcome party for her. Heemin agrees and takes another drink. She glances across the room and notices Professor Seo sitting alone, lost in thought. She keeps glancing at him nervously. Her friend suggests she should introduce herself more to Professor Seo since they'll be seeing each other every day starting tomorrow. She agrees, gathers her courage, and walks over to where he's sitting. She greets him, and he responds by jokingly telling her to sit down unless she enjoys people bumping into her. She awkwardly takes a seat, unsure how to start the conversation. After a moment, she tells him she has something to say. He encourages her to speak up, turning to face her. She flinches, making him think she's afraid of him. He wonders what she's going to say, assuming it will be a thank you for working with him. He decides if she says anything more, it will be the last time they talk. She repeats that she has something important to say. Feeling her nerves, he impatiently urges her to continue. Finally, she turns to him and boldly declares that she doesn't like him and has no romantic feelings toward him. He's surprised to hear this straightforward confession. She explains she just wanted to clear the air so he wouldn't worry about it. He takes a sip of his drink, relieved. She smiles brightly, stands up, and thanks him for listening. With a smile of her own, she walks away. He gazes at her, considering how quiet yet remarkably present she is. She seems shy, but there's a strength about her that isn't mere timidity. Above all, they come from different worlds, and he realizes he completely misjudged her. He tastes the bitterness of alcohol in his mouth. Someone interrupts his thoughts, informing him there's still some alcohol left. He responds with relief, acknowledging the offer. After the party, exhausted, he returns home. As he opens the door warily, he's stunned to find someone sitting comfortably inside. It's So Minhyuk. Minhyuk explains that their mother sent him with food, and he decided to wait and greet his older brother, Professor Seo. However, Seo doesn't react as expected. Minhyuk studies his face closely and asks if something's wrong because Seo doesn't seem happy. He can see that Seo is startled, confused, and probably annoyed. Minhyuk figures he's caught Seo in a very complicated moment. Seo interrupts his thoughts, stating firmly that it's his place. It dawns on Minhyuk. He's invaded Seo's space again. He quickly apologizes, knowing Seo dislikes others invading his personal space. He always regrets it when he ends up in front of Seo like this. Seo stares at him for a moment and starts removing his coat. Minhyuk breathes a sigh of relief. Seo gives him a brief glance, surprising Minhyuk, who wonders if he shouldn't have sighed. He leaves, noting it's the second time he's seen someone around Seo relieved, which Seo doesn't like. As Minhyuk walks away, he's surprised to find his other brother, Seo Woohyuk, rummaging in the fridge. He asks what Woohyuk is doing there. Woohyuk replies that he's looking for something to eat, pointing out it's his home and he wouldn't do that at a stranger's place. He explains he hasn't been able to leave the hospital for a long time and was worried he'd forget what home looked like. He asks if Minhyuk doesn't miss him. In the living room, the three brothers discuss what to do next. One suggests they leave since their mother is waiting for them. But Woohyuk thinks it would be better to stay overnight because it's closer to the hospital he needs to go to early the next day. Minhyuk asks if Hyung will even let them stay, considering he's in a bad mood. Woohyuk jokes it's probably because of them that Hyung's in a bad mood, but Minhyuk disagrees, saying Hyung was already upset before they arrived. They ponder who could have put Hyung in such a foul mood. Eunhyuk remarks he'd like to meet that person. Just then, Hyung calls from his room, letting them know he can hear them. They assure him they were just talking and didn't mean to disturb him further. Hyung starts getting undressed in his room, his mind drifting to Heemin. He wonders what she looks like, guessing she's around Eunhyuk's age. Remembering her straightforward words about not having feelings for him, he lets out a sigh as he pulls off his shirt. The room grows quiet. Outside, the brothers let out relieved sighs, thinking everything is settled. Minhyuk asks Eunhyuk to grab blankets for them. Eunhyuk looks surprised, questioning whether they realize Hyung might kick them out because of his bad mood. One of them shrugs it off, saying they understand Hyung's ways. They believe if he really wanted them gone, he would have already sent them packing. They all nod in agreement, knowing Hyung can come up with 100 reasons to throw someone out on the spot. The next day at work, Hyung walks to his office. Two ladies greet him, and he surprises them by replying. They comment that something seems different about him today. He silently agrees with them. Instead of waiting for potential problems to arise, he decides it's better to nip them in the bud right away. He plans to start looking for a reason to fire her immediately. He opens his office door and finds Heemin inside. She greets him warmly, noting that he's unusually early today. She asks if something's wrong, but he reassures her with a quick no. She mentions she heard about his morning lectures and has already set up his books and attendance register. He steps into his office, noticing everything neatly organized. He inquires if Professor Kang had been there earlier. She confirms he came by to retrieve something. When he asks if she gave it to him, she admits she didn't. She explains that she didn't feel authorized to make that decision without permission. Even though her reasoning is sound, he hesitates to acknowledge it fully. He remarks that Professor Kang is a senior and might have felt disrespected. She agrees, admitting she felt the same, which is why she pretended not to find it. She adds that the professor promised to return later to collect the item. She mentions she's placed his newspapers neatly on the desk and picked up his mail from the mailroom on her way in. He glances down and notices the floor gleaming, wondering if it's always been this clean. Finally, he compliments her on the tidiness, but she dismisses it, saying it's just part of her job. As he walks towards his desk, he hears the floor squeak under his feet, a sign it's been meticulously cleaned. He scans the room, searching for any imperfections, but everything is immaculate. Not a single thing is out of place, and she hasn't touched any of his materials without permission. There's not even a speck of dust to be found. He asks about his coffee, and she apologizes for not having had time to prepare it. She thought it was more important to get everything ready for his research and classes to avoid any problems. He reassures her that she did nothing wrong. Relieved, she pulls out a cup of coffee she had prepared just in case. He looks at her in surprise, feeling like if he asked for hot water, she'd produce a travel mug from thin air. She asks him again if there's anything she can improve on, promising to fix it, and do better next time. He responds with an okay, thinking to himself that she can do whatever she wants. She calls out to him again, repeating what she said yesterday. She insists that he doesn't need to worry about her. Later in the day, after 3 o'clock, Jimin waits outside his nursery school for his sister to pick him up. His teacher, Soojin, meets him there and suggests they wait inside together. Jimin tells her that usually his sister picks him up at 3, but Soojin reminds him that starting today, his sister said she'll be there at 5 o'clock. Just then, Heemin arrives and calls out to Jimin. He rushes over to her, asking why she took so long and hugs her tightly. Soojin remarks how touching their reunion is. Heemin gently scolds Jimin for not waiting inside as she asked. Jimin, still excited to see his sister, asks her why she took so long. Soojin then suggests Jimin ask Heemin about her first day at work. He remembers and excitedly asks Heemin how her day was and if she did a good job. Heemin proudly responds that her boss said she was the best and couldn't do his work without her. Jimin praises her, saying he hasn't seen anyone as good as her before. Soojin interrupts their conversation and asks Jimin to go and get his bag. He wants Heemin to come with him, but both sisters encourage him to go alone, assuring him that Heemin will wait outside for him. Jimin walks off reluctantly to get his bag. Soojin mentions that Jimin still gets anxious sometimes but seems fine during class these days. Heemin asks if Jimin gets along with the other kids, and Soojin assures her that he does, mentioning he's popular because of his looks, something more important to kids than adults realize. Heemin is taken aback hearing a teacher talk like that. Soojin leans in and jokingly tells Heemin she's a good liar, setting a great example for Jimin. She then asks if what Heemin said about her professor needing her at work was true. Heemin confirms it, saying he did mention something similar and that he's glad to have her on board. Soojin seems surprised but agrees. Curious, Soojin asks why Heemin chose to wear those outfits on her first day. Heemin tries to defend her choice, but Soojin interrupts, wondering what if her professor comments on it. Heemin confidently says he wouldn't mind, but Soojin questions how well she knows him. Heemin replies she doesn't really know much about him and prefers to keep it that way. The next day at the college corridor, 3 ladies are chatting. Miss Kim brings up the topic of Professor Seo's new teaching assistant. One of them asks if it's the one who's pretty, but Miss Kim corrects her, saying she's not pretty but mentioning how she dresses. She adds that despite being a humanities major, her style resembles that of a school athlete here for training. One of them remarks that Heemin is very pretty. Another agrees but points out that she often wears sweatshirts or t-shirts. She speculates that maybe Heemin isn't interested in fashion. However, Miss Kim interjects, suggesting that it's all part of Heemin's strategy. She believes Heemin knows Professor Seo didn't want a female assistant, so she dresses more like a man to fit in. Miss Kim describes Heemin as cunning and suggests that her appearance is calculated. She adds that Heemin isn't studying chemistry or in the College of Natural Sciences, which makes her wonder why she's working with Professor Seo from the Humanities College. Miss Kim mentions that Heemin seems to have Dean Han's support, hinting that she's well-connected. The other 2 ladies silently think that Ms. Kim's jealousy towards Heemin is obvious, possibly because she once had a crush on Professor Seo. Miss Kim urges them to keep a close watch on Heemin, confident that soon enough Heemin's true colors will show. She continues chatting, not noticing the door opening behind them. One of the ladies warns her to quiet down because someone is passing by. It turns out to be Heemin, carrying a stack of books. The ladies greet her, but Heemin doesn't respond. As she walks past them, the books slip from her arms and fall to the floor. She quickly bends down to pick them up. Ms. Kim keeps on talking about Heemin, while the others urge her to stop. She argues that if what she's saying is untrue, Heemin would have defended herself. The others point out that Professor Seo hasn't made any comments about Heemin's character, but Ms. Kim insists that he's not a good judge of character because he's so focused on work and lacks judgment of people. Just then, Heemin turns around and responds to Ms. Kim, saying that Professor Seo isn't lacking anything. Ms. Kim asks if Heemin was eavesdropping, but Heemin denies it, explaining that they were just speaking loudly. She insists that Professor Seo knows everything he needs to know and isn't lacking in anything. The others laugh and question how long Heemin has known Professor Seo, emphasizing that they've known him for years. As they continue to argue, Miss Lim approaches them and asks what's happening, noting that it's too early for such noise. She questions whether any of them applied when the job advertisement was posted, suggesting that they didn't and that's why Professor Han recommended someone. Miss Kim tries to explain herself, but Miss Lim cuts her off, telling everyone to forget about it and get back to work. She warns that the professors have just finished their meeting and could arrive at any moment, and it would be embarrassing if they heard what was being said. With that, they all disperse and head back to their tasks. Heemin stoops down to gather the books scattered on the floor. Miss Lim remarks that newcomers always seem to get a rough welcome, no matter where they go. She questions why Heemin bothered responding to them and suggests she should have just ignored their gossip, especially when it involves the professor. Heemin insists that incorrect things should be corrected. Miss Lim thinks Heemin shouldn't get too involved. She pauses and asks if Heemin has feelings for the professor. Heemin denies it, stating she has no romantic interest in him. Miss Lim visibly relaxes and advises Heemin to take the elevator since she's carrying so many books. Heemin agrees and steps into the elevator with her stack of books. Ms. Lim walks down the corridor by herself, mumbling to herself about how there's nothing to worry about because she's not interested in Professor Seo. Just then, Professor Seo appears, coming down the stairs towards her. The next day, Heemin is walking Jimin to school. On their way, Jimin asks her who her favorite person in the whole world is. She smiles and tells him it's him, saying she can't imagine life without him. Curious, Jimin then asks who her second favorite person is. He points out that she likes his teacher, Soojin, and their aunt, along with a few others. Jimin also mentions her boss and asks if he's a professor and if she likes him too. Heemin is taken aback by the question and asks why she should like her boss. Jimin explains that since her boss said he can't do his work without her, it means he must like her. She chuckles and explains they're just colleagues who greet each other and ask how they're doing. Jimin then asks if that means he and Sohyun are close too. Heemin is puzzled and asks who Sohyun is. Jimin tells her Sohyun is a girl in her class who only says hi to him and wonders if that counts as being close. She gazes at him in amazement as he goes on. He mentions how Sohyun always avoids looking at him, runs off, and talks to herself. Curious, she asks if he likes Sohyun. He blushes and admits he does. She teases him, saying he likes her so much he notices everything she does, even though she doesn't say hi to him. He insists you don't have to say you like someone to know it. You can tell by wanting to know them better or looking their way. Just then, a car pulls up beside them, cutting her off. A woman leans out and offers them a ride to school. She invites Heemin too, but Heemin politely declines, explaining they need to stop somewhere else first. She thanks the woman and they drive off. Heemin calms Jimin down and reminds him of what he said about not needing to confess feelings out loud. She asks if they've left anyone out, and Jimin mentions their parents. He quickly pulls his hand away from hers and starts walking ahead. She's taken aback by his reaction. In the school lab, Professor Seo is clearly not pleased with his students. They seem to be struggling to grasp the basics of the experiment. He scolds them for not cleaning the tools properly before starting. One student argues that they cleaned them last period, but he insists that too much time has passed and dust must have settled on everything since then. He emphasizes that every experiment should yield a result, whether right or wrong. Professor Seo orders them to redo the entire experiment, stressing that examining every single detail will reveal where they went wrong initially. He firmly believes in this principle. One student asks what will happen if they double-check everything and still can't find their mistake. Professor Seo declares that if that happens, then it means he made the mistake himself. As he walks out of the lab, two of his female students can't help but stare at him in awe. They start whispering about how he could easily be a model, marveling at his sex appeal. One of them jokes that she almost spilled blood into the beaker because of him, and the other laughs, saying he'd probably find a way to make that charming too. The lone guy in the room is getting annoyed with all the admiration. He mutters that all men are the same. One of the girls playfully retorts that his mere existence seems to defy the laws of nature. The guy scoffs and asks what they think makes the professor so different from other men. The girl confidently replies that he's clearly thinking about profound things, like the principles of the universe or the laws of nature. As he strolls towards his office, the professor's mind is occupied with thoughts about Heemin. He's pondering ways to handle her presence, whether it's due to her background, status, or even romantic interests. Throughout his career, everyone who has come to him has usually wanted something in return. However, Heemin stands out because she never makes any mistakes and is always punctual. Her work is flawless, and no matter how closely he scrutinizes it, he can't find a single flaw. As he walks down the corridor, Professor Seo overhears some students chatting. They're discussing the numerous assignments given by the professor and heading towards his office. One of them wonders aloud if it's fine to hand in the assignment late, to which the other replies that the new teaching assistant will accept it. They continue to gossip about how attractive she is and express admiration for her. There's even a hint of concern about her working closely with Professor Seo, joking that he might accidentally inject toxins into her one day. Just then, the elevator arrives and they step inside, continuing their conversation as the doors close. Standing where Professor Seo is, he can hear every word of their conversation clearly. He nods his head in acknowledgement, noting that it appears she has decided to accept late assignments after all. He walks down the hallway toward his office, feeling a bit surprised when he hears that she didn't accept the reports from the students. She explains to him that it goes against the rules to accept late submissions because it wouldn't be fair to those who handed them in on time. He looks at her with a puzzled expression, considering her reasoning. Then he suggests taking her out for lunch as a gesture of appreciation. At the cafe, they sit across from each other. She looks visibly anxious and nervous, her feelings showing clearly. He steals glances at her over the menu and thinks she looks like a startled rabbit, as if he's found her weakness. He wonders when he started observing her like this and drops the menu onto the table. She quickly speaks up, saying he doesn't need to do this because she always brings her own lunch. He reassures her it's just a meal and asks why she's so worried. She mentions the presence of many students from their university around, making her uncomfortable. He reaches for the cutlery, but she offers to set it up for him. He declines politely, saying he doesn't need her to serve him outside of their usual work context. He tells her to focus on her duties as his teaching assistant, to which she nods okay with a smile. He tells her this, and she feels happy. He didn't realize that ignoring her could bother her. He suggests she doesn't need to come to work so early just to be fully prepared for classes. He mentions another teaching assistant who works in the lab. She says his name, surprising him that she knows him. She explains that the man has visited the office a few times. He wonders if she's always one step ahead. He asks if she's met the others, saying as a humanities major in the chemistry department, she needs to introduce herself properly. She replies she's met everyone in the department except one person. When he asks who, she mentions his name. She says they don't have to do it, but he doesn't mind. He suggests they talk about it after they eat. She's never shy about speaking her mind. He hears a voice and recognizes it as Seo Eun-hyuk's. Two waitresses chat about him and his upcoming project. He turns to her and asks if she's into celebrities, but she says no, which makes him feel relieved. He's not alone in that. She mentions her little brother likes Seo Eun-hyuk. Surprised, he asks if she has a brother, and she confirms it, saying he looks just like her. She goes on about how handsome her brother is. He shares he has 3 brothers who are completely different from him. She admits she's jealous, always wondering what having siblings would be like. He never thought about it that way. Curious, she asks how his brothers are, and he says they're nice. She comments they must have gotten that from him, and he wonders how that works. He tells her there's a lot more they need to learn about each other. They stroll back to the college building together. He asks to confirm which department she's from, and she nods, saying she majored in Korean and Korean literature. He remarks it won't be easy handling chemistry materials, and wonders if she's ready to work even harder. She assures him she's up for anything he asks. He jokes about whether Dean Han tricked her into applying for the job. Suddenly, he stops, turns to her, and holds out his hand for a handshake. She looks surprised, leaving his hand hanging there. He insists she shouldn't overthink it and that it's just a gesture to make her comfortable. After a moment, she finally shakes his hand. He introduces himself as Seo Jihyeok, a chemistry professor who values honesty and rules. He mentions his 3 brothers, all very different from him, and suggests she'll learn more about him gradually. 2 young ladies witness their handshake. She introduces herself as Yoon Heemin and mentions her younger brother, who looks a lot like her. Pausing for a moment, she hesitates on what else to say. He prompts her, teasingly asking if she's going to say the usual, that she doesn't have feelings for him. She laughs and confirms it, and they both share a chuckle over it. Ms. Kim is chatting with one of the ladies who saw Professor Seo shaking hands with Heemin. The lady tells her all about it, and Ms. Kim is absolutely shocked. She can't believe what she's hearing. She never expected the professor to shake Heemin's hand, especially not in public. She's furious and starts wondering who Heemin really is. The news has caught her off guard, and she's determined to get to the bottom of this. It's the next day, and Professor Seo is on his way to class when he runs into Professor Han. The dean asks him about the rumors circulating regarding him shaking hands with Heemin in front of the college building, especially considering the current situation. Jihyeok doesn't see the issue with it and asks if it would be better to do such things secretly. Dean Han starts to understand his point and then asks about Heemin's competence. Jihyeok admits she's been doing all right so far. The dean looks at him intently, silently swearing to himself. Dean Han then suggests that if Jihyeok seemed unenthusiastic about her, he would have assigned her to another professor who might appreciate her more. Jihyeok dismisses the suggestion, saying there's no need to pretend about caring for her. He emphasizes that he does care, and if there were a better fit for her, he would have placed her there from the start. Dean Han reluctantly agrees but tries to interject with more about Heemin's background, mentioning her hard-working nature since childhood. Jihyeok cuts him off, insisting he prefers to form his own opinions about people rather than listen to others' preconceptions. He then hurriedly heads off to his class, leaving Dean Han with his thoughts. He heads to his class where the students are already seated. Walking to the front, he's just about to begin when there's a knock on the door. It's Heemin, entering to take attendance. The classroom fills with murmurs and chatter. As soon as she steps inside, it feels like a gentle spring breeze has swept through the room. Though he tries to resist, he can't help stealing glances at her. It's evening, and Jihyeok arrives home. Eunhyuk greets him as he walks in. They settle in the living room, where Eunhyuk addresses him by his full name, prompting Jihyeok to ask why. Eunhyuk explains he's around because they're shooting a drama nearby and will soon film on campus too. He reassures Jihyeok he won't acknowledge him during filming. Eunhyuk continues, noting Jihyeok seems to be in a better mood than last time he visited. Jihyeok asks if that's true, and Eunhyuk confirms they talked about it during their previous visit. Jihyeok thinks Eunhyuk isn't completely clueless. He settles into a chair, and Eunhyuk asks who put him in a bad mood and who cheered him up. Jihyeok wonders why Eunhyuk thinks it's the same person. Eunhyuk argues it's unlikely there would be 2 people affecting him in 1 week after none for 10 years. Jihyeok refuses to spill the beans, suggesting Eunhyuk watch TV instead of bothering him. Eunhyuk happily agrees, turns on a cartoon channel, and a popular show is about to start. Jihyeok teases him for watching cartoons at his age. Eunhyuk defends himself, saying he missed out on a normal childhood and deserves to enjoy it now. Jihyeok asks if it's really that fun, and Eunhyuk explains the show's popularity. The character in the show can pull anything from a magic pocket, which represents a modern fantasy. As Jihyeok's mind wanders back to the office, he recalls when Heemin handed him what he needed. He mentions it's quite similar. Eunhyuk asks what he means and jokes if there's someone who doesn't like him. The next day in the office, he's looking around for his notepad, but Heemin hands it to him right away. He asks if she has a red pen, and she pulls one out of her bag. Then he asks for scissors, and she says yes, handing them over too. His mind drifts back to last night when he asked his brother why that character in the cartoon carries everything with him. His brother said it's because he doesn't live with his family. After a while, he asks Heemin if she goes straight home to her family after work. She says yes, and he feels relieved to hear that. He notices her smiling and asks what's funny. She explains it's interesting to see him relieved about things because he seems to have everything already. He asks what she thinks about him, and she says he strikes her as someone whose daily life is impressive, whether he's driving, eating, or looking after his younger brothers. He gazes at her intently. She suddenly stops and clarifies she doesn't want him to misunderstand. She doesn't like him romantically. He nods, knowing she's said that before. He then asks about the days she doesn't go straight home after work, wondering where she goes. She looks at him silently for a moment. He wonders who she's meeting that makes her blush like that. He wonders who she's planning to meet when they're interrupted by a knock on the door. Mr. Park, the other teaching assistant, pops his head in and tells the professor there's a fax that needs double-checking and he needs his help. Reluctantly, he stands up to go. As they walk along, Mr. Park expresses relief at meeting the professor in the office, mentioning they were struggling to figure things out on their own. He asks why the professor jumped to conclusions without researching first. Curious about the laboratory, the professor asks how many people work there, and Mr. Park informs him there are 4, excluding him. Assuring the professor not to worry, Mr. Park acknowledges his reputation as a perfectionist and promises they won't slack off. Professor Seo pauses. Being a perfectionist, he realizes he didn't hear Heemin's answer, which bothers him. He instructs Mr. Park to go ahead while he returns to his office. How could he, a perfectionist, overlook something like this? Truthfully, he doesn't care about the exact content of her answer. What matters is grasping the situation and reaching his own conclusion, a principle he always adheres to. He enters his office and finds Heemin on the phone, expressing love to someone. Unaware of his presence, she assures the person she'll join them soon. He quietly closes the door behind him, pondering why he's bothered by her habit of carrying everything in her bag and wearing the same clothes daily. Why is he so curious about her? And why does a random TV character remind him of her? What's going on with him? That expression she just made on the phone. Is he disappointed because he's never seen it before? It's a regular school day for Jimin. He's sitting in class when a girl offers him scissors, but he politely declines, saying his sister will bring his own. Another classmate overhears and starts teasing Jimin, asking why he always waits for his sister and suggesting he can't do anything without her. Jimin insists he can manage fine without her right now, but the boy keeps pushing, sure that she'll show up eventually. The boy continues, questioning why Jimin's sister picks him up every day if she has a job. Jimin explains patiently that she works far away and can't come earlier. Sohyun tries to calm the situation, but the boy won't let up. He starts saying hurtful things about Jimin's sister, like how she wears the same clothes every day and doesn't look like she has a job. This really upsets Jimin, and tears start welling up in his eyes. Just then, Heemin walks into the classroom, apologizing for being late. She notices Jimin upset and quickly takes him away to find out what's wrong. As they walk home together, Jimin starts chatting with Heemin about their future school. He's excited about the bigger playground there, especially the longer slide, but he worries it might dirty his pants. Heemin assures him she can wash them if they get dirty, but Jimin insists he doesn't want to give her more work. He then tells Heemin about finding a maple leaf earlier that day and how Soyeon found one too. Heemin compliments Soyeon's beauty and wonders if they're close friends, but Jimin denies it. Curious, he asks if Heemin's boss likes her. She nods and explains he's not mean to her despite her casual work clothes because he needs her help and thinks she's important. Relieved to hear this, Jimin gives Heemin a hug. It's nighttime and she tucks him into bed. Noticing how he's gradually returning to his usual self, she feels relieved seeing him finally drift off to sleep. What a relief, she murmurs softly to herself, realizing she's been using that phrase a lot lately. Thoughts of Professor Seo cross her mind as she reflects on it. The next day at school, Professor Seo is in the lab with his students, guiding them through an experiment. He points out that they should have double-checked their measurements before proceeding, emphasizing that such carefulness prevents errors. He explains the correct approach to achieve accurate results, engrossed in the discussion when suddenly a phone rings. It's Heemin's phone. Heemin quickly apologizes for the interruption. Professor Seo kindly tells her she can take the call there if she needs to. She excuses herself and steps away. Mr. Park notices her hurried departure, suggesting it might be something urgent. One of the students jokes that it could be her boyfriend calling. Mr. Park agrees, commenting on how attractive Heemin is, and decides he'll ask her about it later at dinner. Meanwhile, Professor Seo, who has been quietly observing, interrupts, asking if they are focused on the experiment. Mr. Park apologizes, explaining they were just kidding around. The professor's expression turns serious as he tells them it's not a laughing matter. Mr. Park realizes Professor Seo isn't letting this slide as he usually would. Heemin slips out of the lab and quickly answers the call. It's Sujin, Jimin's teacher. Sujin checks in on Heemin, concerned about how she's feeling after the incident with the boy yesterday. She mentions she warned him not to say hurtful things. Heemin asks about Jimin, and Sujin reassures her he's doing fine and playing happily. Heemin admits she was upset when she picked him up yesterday but didn't say anything. Sujin understands she was hiding her feelings and tells her not to worry about Jimin. Heemin shares that she's not sure about attending the dinner, mentioning Jimin isn't in a good mood. Sujin insists he's okay and encourages Heemin to go and have fun at the dinner, getting to know people from the school better. She assures Heemin that Jimin will go home with her after work, so she doesn't need to come pick him up. Heemin worries about what her parents will say, but Sujin explains her mother prepared enough food, and it wouldn't be good if she hears he won't be coming over again. Thinking about the dinner, Heemin wonders if it's a chance to get to know that person better. She shares her plan with Sujin, considering whether attending the dinner could be a good idea. She returns to the lab with drinks for everyone, and Mr. Park seems delighted. He asks how she knew they were all thirsty and jokingly suggests taking her out for coffee sometime. She glances at Professor Seo and offers him a drink too. He thanks her, but she insists there's no need for thanks. The professor then tells her she doesn't have to do this again. Confused, Heemin asks what he means. He reminds her she's busy, and she begins to walk away, pondering his words. Mr. Park asks Heemin if she's coming to dinner tonight, mentioning that everyone on the research team will be there, and they're all excited for her to join. He hints that Professor Seo would be glad to see her there. Feeling unsure, Heemin looks at Professor Seo for guidance. Professor Seo intervenes, reminding Mr. Park about not pressuring Heemin into uncomfortable situations. He asks why Mr. Park is pushing her to attend. Turning to Heemin, he directly asks her to tell Mr. Park whether she's coming or not. Feeling pressured, Heemin apologizes to Mr. Park, explaining that she already has plans for the night. However, she promises to join them for the next dinner. She walks away, checking if they need more drinks. Professor Seo continues explaining the experiment, but they all look at him with curious expressions, like they want to say something. Sensing their hesitation, he encourages them to speak up if they have any questions or concerns. Mr. Park steps closer to him and requests Professor Seo to clarify a specific part of the explanation once more. The students nod in agreement, eager to understand the experiment better. Later in the evening, Heemin is still at the office, wrapping up some work. She decides to call Sujin to check in. Sujin picks up and asks Heemin how the dinner is going. Heemin replies that it's going well so far, and Sujin expresses her happiness that Heemin is starting to attend such events. During their conversation, Jimin overhears and eagerly asks his sister if she's having dinner with her boss. He tells her that her boss must be buying her dinner because she's smart and hardworking, and he can't do anything without her. Heemin confirms his guess, and Jimin smiles in relief, knowing his sister is valued at work. Sujin then calls Jimin to come eat, letting him know that dinner is ready. Heemin encourages Jimin to go ahead and eat, and they end their call. With no rush to go home early that evening, Heemin decides to take a look around the office before leaving. As she glances around, her eyes catch sight of an envelope stuck to a drawer. Heemin wanders through a dimly lit corridor, eventually finding her way to a brightly lit one. Checking her phone, she's caught off guard as Professor Han approaches and asks what she's doing there. He wonders if Professor Seo upset her, but she quickly assures him that Professor Seo has been good to her. Professor Han seems surprised and presses on, asking if something else is bothering her, maybe something to do with Jimin. Heemin denies it. Just then, Professor Seo steps out of the elevator, startling them both. Professor Han jokes about being scared, mentioning they were just discussing Professor Seo. Professor Seo responds coldly, asking if he upset Heemin. His gaze falls on her, and she's anxious, fearing his displeasure. She finds herself alone with Professor Seo in the corridor, and quickly clarifies that she wasn't gossiping about him. He casually responds that he doesn't mind, which surprises her and leaves her feeling downcast. As he looks at her closely, he recalls Mr. Park's comment about her seeming low lately, suggesting she might have had a disagreement with her boyfriend. He remembers seeing her in a similar mood at their department dinner, and assumes it must be relationship troubles at her age. Observing her further, he wonders why her usual smile hasn't returned. Considering there might be someone else involved, he turns to her and explains that if someone gives others a reason to gossip, they probably will. He assures her it's not a big deal, but she insists it didn't happen like that. Changing the subject, he asks if she's been doing okay recently, just wanting to make sure everything's fine. She assures him she's okay as long as he's not upset with her, to which he replies with relief. He looks at her, realizing he didn't expect her to share what's bothering her. But what surprises him more is that his assumptions were correct and she is upset. Later in the day at Jimin's school, Heemin arrives to pick him up. Jimin is happily playing on the slide when she gets there. Soojin approaches Heemin and remarks on her punctuality, noting that she's early. She suggests treating both Heemin and Jimin to pasta, but Heemin insists that Soojin always pays and it's her turn today. Soojin refuses, pointing out that Heemin is only a part-time worker, whereas she is full-time, plus it's her payday, so she insists on treating them. Heemin then mentions that perhaps Soojin should use the money to buy clothes for Jimin instead, recalling that their mother had commented on Jimin's clothes looking quite thin last time. Jimin rummages through his bag eagerly, searching for something, and finally finds it, a bunch of new toys. He proudly shows them to Heemin, explaining that Soojin's parents bought them for him. However, Heemin doesn't seem too thrilled about it. She comments that there are too many toys. Soojin steps in and explains that their parents can't buy toys for Heemin anymore, since she's an adult now, and also mentions that Jimin didn't ask for the toys himself. They were given to him as a gift. Jimin nods in agreement, confirming that he didn't request them. Heemin tells Soojin to go ahead and wait at the restaurant. She assures her that she'll join them soon. Soojin agrees and leaves Jimin and Heemin alone together. Jimin plays happily with his new toys, clearly enjoying them. Heemin notices his happiness and asks him why he didn't ask her to buy the toys for him. Jimin doesn't respond immediately, so she takes a closer look at him and notices that his clothes seem very thin. Concerned, she asks if he's feeling cold, but Jimin insists that he's okay. Feeling guilty, Heemin apologizes to him, surprising Jimin with her apology. She explains that she's sorry she didn't realize how cold he might have been. Jimin looks at her and says he's relieved, prompting her to ask why he feels relieved. Jimin replies that he's glad because she's not mad at him. Heemin reassures Jimin that she could never be mad at him. She adds that next time, if he needs anything, he shouldn't hesitate to ask her before asking anyone else. She wants him to know that she's always there to help him. The next day, we find Professor Seo looking tense in his friend's office at the hospital. His friend, who happens to be a doctor, questions why he's there instead of at the lab. Seo mentions they still have plenty of time before the deadline, but his friend Jihyeok worries they won't make it if they keep slacking off. Seo's friend teases him about feeling guilty, suggesting they grab a meal together, but Seo turns him down. Then, his friend suggests going for drinks after work, but Seo declines again, which frustrates his friend, who demands to know why he's even in his office if he's not going to socialize. They're sitting at a table with tea, and a few girls behind them keep glancing over and giggling. His friend leans in, remarking that he seems to attract attention effortlessly. He presses the professor again, asking if something's bothering him. Seo shakes his head, denying any issues, and wonders why his friend thinks something's up. His friend insists he's not the type to drop by without a reason, pointing out they're not inseparable besties who can't go a day without seeing each other. "You didn't skip med school just to avoid your dad's hospital, did you?" he jokes. Seo remembers to mention that Minhyuk will swing by later. His friend shrugs, saying he didn't invite him, knowing Minhyuk would come anyway. They're in the same department. Professor Seo sighs anxiously. His friend gives him a concerned look, saying there's definitely something wrong with him. He asks why Seo's so glum, and tells him he's giving off serious, dark vibes. Seo wonders aloud if he should leave, but his friend tells him not to be so dramatic, suggesting he just lighten up and smile a bit. He points to a couple nearby as an example, saying they're practically glowing with happiness, and Seo should find someone who makes him smile like that. Seo nods in agreement, acknowledging his friend's point. His friend leans closer, puzzled why Seo is sitting there muttering about some mysterious person. He asks Seo what's on his mind. Seo explains that someone he knows seems to be dating someone who's making her unhappy lately. His friend probes, asking how Seo knows this person, but Seo avoids answering directly. His friend suggests maybe she's always been like that, but Seo disagrees. He confesses it's been bothering him for a few days now, and that's the only explanation he can come up with. His friend looks surprised that it's bothering him so much. Seo clarifies that she's technically someone he's responsible for, which his friend understands as a reason for him to care. Seo sums it up, saying a person under his responsibility seems to be in a relationship with someone who's not good for her, and it's weighing on him. His friend agrees that if she were being treated well, she'd be smiling, and Seo wouldn't have reason to worry about her. He suggests they grab a drink, but his friend reminds him he didn't want one earlier. Seo shrugs it off, saying forget it if he's not up for it. His friend decides to go along and change. Seo reminds him to take off his trademark headgear, insisting it's a must in their department for everyone to have something cute. Just then, a child hops by happily with her toy, but slips and almost falls. Seo quickly rushes to catch her before she hits the ground, and he picks up her toy, a cartoon character named Ruru. This reminds him of Heemin's fondness for it. The child introduces herself gratefully. Nearby, some ladies behind his friend giggle and whisper about how handsome Seo is, wondering if he's a celebrity. His friend is used to people always admiring Seo's looks. Minhyuk leans over and asks if Seo's brother stole the balloon from the child. His friend quickly pulls Minhyuk away, saying that's not the issue right now. It's evening, and Heemin is in her office. She pulls down the curtain to dim the light. As she does, her eyes fall on a letter that arrived earlier. Opening it, she finds it's a bill for property tax. Sitting at her desk, she feels dejected, unsure of who to turn to for help. She thinks about her auntie Sujin and Professor Han. She hesitates, thinking she can't keep depending on them. She worries it will all become a burden for Jimin eventually. She ponders her options, wondering what she should do next. The next day at school, Professor Seo heads to the library to grab some books. He's feeling the effects of last night's drinking session. As he walks, he notices Heemin across the way. She doesn't seem her usual lively self, and he can't help but wonder what's bothering her. He slows his pace, considering whether something or someone is causing her distress. She walks away to take a phone call while trying to grab a book. Nearby, behind a tall shelf, Professor Seo overhears voices of other teaching assistants. He wonders if it's time for all the TAs to gather. Deciding to quickly grab his books and leave, he overhears one TA asking if someone isn't coming today. Ms. Kim chimes in, asking if they're talking about Heemin and suggesting she probably left early. Another woman mentions seeing Heemin here last time. Professor Seo listens quietly as Miss Kim remarks that nobody really cares whether Heemin is around or not, doubting she'd have anything to say if she were here. The other woman advises Miss Kim not to be so harsh, mentioning she overheard Heemin talking on the phone near the emergency exit earlier. It seems she's been dealing with something lately. The woman continues, saying Heemin is borrowing money and doesn't know what it's for, maybe clothes or rent, but she doesn't seem all right. Miss Kim remarks that Heemin doesn't care about fashion, noting she walks to work every day, implying she lives nearby and likely comes from a wealthy family. Miss Kim speculates that Heemin might be involved in a pyramid scheme and drowning in debt. They continue to gossip negatively about Heemin, unaware that Professor Seo is silently listening nearby. Miss Kim goes further, suggesting that by Heemin's appearance she might be borrowing money from people. Professor Seo can't bear to hear any more. He steps forward, interrupting them sharply. He asks them who would believe such baseless rumors and gossip. They are taken aback to see him there. Professor Seo scolds them, saying spreading unverified information about others shows they aren't mature adults. He adds that creating false narratives indicates they aren't intelligent enough to be scholars. He criticizes them for believing anything they hear without evidence. Ms. Kim tries to explain, but he cuts her off, telling them to stop if they have any conscience left. He turns away coldly, leaving them stunned. Ms. Kim trembles, falling to the floor in shock. In the stairway, Heemin is on the phone with her auntie, desperately asking for money. Her aunt is angry, questioning why she's bothering her and how she plans to raise Jimin alone if she keeps acting like this. Unbeknownst to Heemin, Professor Seo approaches quietly from behind. Heemin reassures her aunt that Jimin is okay, but she needs to discuss repaying the money her father borrowed from her before he passed away. Her aunt is incredulous. Heemin reminds her of the promise she made to her mother to repay the loan once her husband's investments were settled. Her aunt questions why she should repay money her father borrowed and told her not to repay. Heemin insists there's a signed contract, prompting her aunt to ask for proof. Professor Seo hesitates, considering leaving, but stops midway to listen further. Heemin talks about the house, explaining she won't sell it because she wants to keep it for Jimin. Her aunt demands to know what Heemin plans to do, urging her to go out and find money herself. She wonders aloud why Heemin won't sell the house if she can't maintain it, accusing her of being greedy. Finally, her aunt tells Heemin not to contact her again if this is how she's going to behave, and abruptly ends the call. Trembling, Heemin decides to climb the stairs and head back to work. At the top of the stairs, Professor Seo notices her and advises her to watch her steps. She misses a footing and almost stumbles, but he quickly asks if she's okay. She reassures him that she's fine, and he lets out his usual, "What a relief." As she prepares to leave to get the keys for the laboratory, Professor Seo stops her. He compliments her on being good at her job, but bluntly adds that she's terrible at pretending everything is okay. He tells her he knows she's not all right, so she shouldn't pretend otherwise. Slowly, she turns to face him, unsure of what to say. They're both in the office together. Heemin asks Professor Seo if he wants some coffee, offering to go get water to make it. He tells her not to worry about it, saying he'd actually like to have a chat with her. They sit facing each other in silence. Heemin wonders how much he knows about her situation. Professor Seo breaks the silence, asking if that's what she's been hiding all this time. She looks at him without speaking, feeling the weight of his words. Finally, she gathers herself and apologizes, promising it won't happen again. He agrees with her, but then reaches into his pocket and pulls out a sheet of paper. He tells her he can't tolerate his work being disrupted by personal distractions, especially those related to personal matters. Handing her the paper, he instructs her to write it down. Confused, she asks what he means. He explains that he's heard she's in need of money and suggests she solve that issue so she can focus on her work. She denies it's about money, but he presses her, asking if she has another solution to her problem. She's at a loss for words, admitting she can't ask him for money. He asks whose decision it is to make, emphasizing he needs her to get back to normal so he can focus on his work. She hesitates, unsure about his offer. He clarifies that he's not giving her the money but lending it, jokingly asking if she plans to run off with it. She assures him she won't. He smiles knowingly, noticing her voice has returned to normal. She sits there, lost in thought, debating what to do or say. Finally, she picks up her pen and starts scribbling on the paper he gave her. Glancing up at him, he sees the determination in her eyes. He asks if there's another issue bothering her. She shakes her head, admitting she's just scared she won't be able to pay back all the money right away. even though she intends to eventually. He studies her for a moment and then asks if she doubts his ability to collect his money back. He hands her a book and explains his tight schedule, mentioning he's gearing up for his next thesis. He tells her he doesn't care what she does as long as she translates everything in the book for him. However, when it comes to the money he's lending her, he emphasizes that he'll do whatever it takes to ensure he gets it back. He reassures her to just focus on her work. She responds, noting he didn't even bother to ask how much she needs. He casually asks if it's a few 100 million won, joking that he'll have to wire it to her later since he can't transfer it right away. She shakes her head, saying it's not that much. He nods understandingly, relieved to hear it's less. She adds that he doesn't even know what kind of person she really is. He asks her if she knows herself, reminding her she's his teaching assistant. He quips if there's anything else he should know about her besides that role. She slides the paper over to him, promising she'll work really hard. He takes it and checks the amount, surprised it's not as much as he expected. Placing it on his desk, he tries to comfort her with the old saying that problems solved with money are the easiest kind. She manages a smile but tells him it's not much of a consolation. He chuckles, impressed she can still joke in tough times. She thanks him sincerely for his kindness, admitting she feels foolish for needing his help. Tears well up, and he pulls out his handkerchief, offering it to her. He gently advises her not to wait so long to share her problems with him in the future. Gratefully, she takes it and nods. It's evening, and Professor Seo arrives home to a surprise. His brothers are there. They've already eaten and left a mess around the place. He looks around, puzzled, and asks them what's going on. They greet him cheerfully as he takes in the scene. He walks in and announces he's changing the door passcode to prevent them from entering when he's not around. They look surprised at the news. Woo-hyuk turns to Min-hyuk, blaming him for getting their brother mad because it was his idea to come and check up on him. Min-hyuk defends himself, insisting something seemed really wrong that made them want to check on him. Min-hyuk turns to Jihyeok, pulling out a paper and explaining they didn't come without a reason. He hands over the paper showing he's sent the money as instructed. Jihyeok snatches it from him. Min-hyuk questions why he had to go to the bank when online transfer is easier. Jihyeok insists on secrecy, not wanting any chance of word getting out. He notices the recipient's name and remarks it seems like it's a woman. Woo-hyuk is surprised by this revelation. Jihyeok asks if there's a problem with sending money to a woman. They reply no, just curious. Jihyeok then brings up other issues. He asks Woo-hyuk why he can't figure out how to take out the trash at his age, and questions Min-hyuk about his habit of leaving clothes on the floor. Meanwhile, Eun-hyuk sits on the floor, watching TV and finding it amusing. He comments on the show Roru. Min-hyuk interrupts him, asking to turn off the TV and get up. Jihyeok intervenes, suggesting they leave Eun-hyuk alone and focus on themselves. The brothers are taken aback by this unexpected stance. Eun-hyuk requests permission to turn up the TV volume, which Jihyeok allows. Min-hyuk and Woo-hyuk are astonished, realizing Jihyeok seems to be taking sides now. They exchange looks, quickly concluding that things have shifted with Jihyeok. The next day, Professor Seo arrives at his office and is greeted by Mr. Park, who proudly shows him the book Heemin has translated. Mr. Park remarks it's much better than hiring a company for the job. Heemin humbly interrupts, saying it's not as good as he thinks and she only rushed because she heard it was urgent. Mr. Park continues praising her, mentioning how she even researched specialized books on the subject. Heemin explains that understanding the theory is crucial for accurate translation. Professor Seo asks if this is true, intrigued by her approach. Mr. Park keeps on with the compliments until he's interrupted by a call to lead students in the library. He hesitates, wanting to stay, but he's ordered out because he won't take full responsibility for any accidents. Reluctantly, he steps out of the office. Alone in the office with Heemin, the professor reviews her work. She assures him if there are any mistakes, he should inform her. He responds by saying he won't give her more money even if she corrects any mistakes. She looks puzzled, not understanding his point. He explains that she's not supposed to work so hard. She looks at him in disbelief and refuses, insisting she wants to work hard and do her best. He simply replies with an okay. Mr. Park walks into the office with the books, announcing they're all finished and suggesting they reconvene after lunch. Professor Seo dismisses the idea of going back and forth, insisting they all eat together. Mr. Park happily agrees and turns to Heemin, asking if she wants to join. She declines, explaining she has somewhere else to be. Professor Seo inquires if her meeting is important, and she confirms it's to pick up her brother earlier than usual. He grants her permission to leave. As she heads out, Heemin pulls out a pack of homemade sandwiches she prepared for herself, but decides to give to Mr. Park since she's leaving. He gratefully accepts them. One of them wonders if they should offer the sandwiches to Professor Seo first, but Mr. Park explains that the professor doesn't like that kind of food and prefers Korean dishes. Hearing this, Professor Seo confirms it, surprising them all. Heemin bows to the professor and leaves. Mr. Park, still amused, asks what else the professor dislikes. With a deadpan expression, Professor Seo jokes that he dislikes Mr. Park, then starts walking away. Mr. Park is momentarily shocked, but then laughs it off, saying the professor is funny and he almost believed him for a moment. The professor remarks on the importance of having the right mindset for successful research. Mr. Park asks what kind of mindset that is, and Professor Seo responds by questioning why Mr. Park assumed he was joking in the first place. The next day, Heemin takes Jimin to a boutique to shop for clothes. Inside, the attendant admires Jimin, saying he's so pretty that she almost mistook him for a girl. Jimin quickly corrects her, asserting he's a boy and that it's not true. Heemin smiles at her son's response and continues shopping with him. They browse through different outfits, trying on various styles until they find the perfect ones. Jimin excitedly picks out his favorites, happy with his new clothes. Heemin enjoys this time with her son, cherishing these moments together. They walk around the store browsing for clothes. The attendant suggests they look for a coat that Jimin can wear all winter, especially since he's active outdoors. Jimin asks if they're going somewhere special with his new clothes, but Heemin explains he'll wear them to school, where his friends, including Seoyeon, will be surprised. He grins happily at the thought. Jimin then asks why Heemin isn't getting anything for herself. The attendant offers a red cloth, saying it would complement her skin tone. Heemin tries it on, and it looks really beautiful on her, but she decides not to buy it. The attendant is disappointed, expecting a sale. She goes to wrap up the cloth. While waiting, Heemin notices a display of scarves and gloves in a showcase. The attendant mentions they're a popular gift set for men. She asks if Heemin wants to check them out, but Heemin declines, saying it's okay. They continue their shopping, trying on various outfits and discussing which ones Jimin likes best for his school surprise. In the office, Professor Seo walks alongside Dean Han, who remarks on hearing about how busy he's been with his thesis. He asks if everything's been going well for him lately, and Professor Seo confirms it has. Dean Han reassures him that as a professor, he'll manage just fine. Dean Han then inquires about Heemin, mentioning she hasn't visited him even when he asked. Professor Seo replies that she doesn't come to him either. The dean jokingly suggests it's because Professor Seo looks intimidating around her. Professor Seo smiles at the thought of Heemin and considers whether to share something with the dean. After all, he thinks of her like his own daughter. Before he can say anything, Dean Han turns to him directly and asks if there's something on his mind. Professor Seo decides against sharing and says there isn't. The dean suggests they grab lunch together, but Professor Seo declines, citing the need to organize some data in his office. The dean seems disappointed by the refusal. In the office, Professor Seo casually asks Heemin about her age. She answers that she's 26 years old, explaining she started school early and is younger than most of her peers. He looks at her, not wanting her to smile while answering. He silently regrets not joining Professor Han for lunch and realizes he's been rambling about trivial matters. Heemin shifts uncomfortably and asks if he plans to go out again. Curious, he asks why she's wondering. She stumbles over her words, unsure of what to say. He then asks if she needs more money, to which she quickly replies no. He breathes a sigh of relief, scolding himself for even thinking she might. She mentions it's almost lunchtime, but he interrupts, realizing she brings her own lunch. He gets up to change, mentioning he has a lunch meeting with the dean who prefers Korean food, as Mr. Park mentioned. She nods, saying that's why she packed Korean food for him. She explains she wanted to show gratitude for lending her money and allowing her to continue working there, adding that anything else would feel forced. He considers taking the lunch, but she suggests giving it to the lab assistants since he's dining with the dean. He questions why she'd do that when she packed it for him. She admits it's true, but since he's going with the dean, she thought it would be better used there. He mentions the dean isn't fond of him, surprising her. He adds that he's aware she isn't his biggest fan either, though perhaps not to the same extent as the dean. He takes the food from her, leaving her impressed by his actions. He opens the lunchbox and finds an array of Korean dishes inside. She mentions she noticed the last time they ate at that restaurant, he didn't seem to enjoy the meat dishes much, so she wasn't sure if he'd like them. He looks at the food, pleasantly surprised by the variety and effort she put into preparing it. He thanks her sincerely, saying he appreciates her thoughtfulness. She smiles warmly, relieved that he likes it. He starts eating, commenting on how delicious everything tastes. They chat about the food and some work-related topics while he eats. She feels happy seeing him enjoy the meal she made for him. She watches him closely as he starts to eat, and he thanks her sincerely for preparing the food. She gazes at him and thinks how, even while eating, he carries himself with such dignity. He comments that the food tastes good, and she responds with relief, glad that he likes it. He mentions that she seems to enjoy packing her own lunch, and she explains it's more convenient for her, and she doesn't know many people around. He nods, saying they're similar in that respect. She takes a moment to express her gratitude again for the money he lent her, explaining that it helped resolve some family issues. She starts to elaborate, but he interrupts kindly, saying there's no need for her to explain further. She acknowledges that it was a substantial amount of money, and he jokes that he's charging her interest, which surprises her. They continue eating and chatting comfortably, discussing various topics from work to personal preferences. She feels a sense of warmth and understanding between them, appreciating his support and the opportunity to talk openly with him. She starts by explaining how she always packs her lunch, considering it a daily routine for herself and her brother. He asks if she packs for anyone else, but before she can finish explaining, he assures her it's fine. As they eat, an awkward silence fills the room, with her observing him and wondering how to ease the tension. Finally, she breaks the silence by mentioning her upcoming tasks, researching data for the thesis and visiting the admission office. She adds that she might need to return to school over the weekend. He asks if she had any plans for the weekend, and she replies that she didn't. After he finishes eating, she offers to clear the table, but he insists she doesn't need to worry. As they both reach for the plates, their hands accidentally brush against each other. They share a momentary glance, and then she quickly withdraws, telling him not to misunderstand, that as he knows, she doesn't like him. He finishes her sentence, and she realizes she needs to prepare the laboratory, grabbing her bag and leaving in a rush, mentioning she forgot about her busy schedule for the day. Closing the door behind her, she reflects on their interaction, particularly stuck on his mention of liking him, pondering why that thought lingers in her mind. A few hours later, Yoon Heemin calls Professor Seo, suggesting they go for lunch together. He's surprised when the professor says he's already eaten. Yoon Heemin asks who he ate with, and the professor suggests he call Minhyuk or Woohyuk instead. Yoon Heemin complains they talk too much and insists he's already at the school, urging the professor to join him if he's not full yet. However, Professor Seo insists he's full. Yoon Heemin persists, asking who the professor ate with and even begs him not to hang up. Finally, the professor relents and mentions there were many different dishes. Yoon Heemin comments it's unusual for him to eat so much, guessing the food must have been really good. Professor Seo admits he's not sure, as he's forgotten that detail. Looking over, the professor notices Heemin nearby. It's the weekend, and Heemin walks with Jimin to school. She reminds him to behave himself and do well in class. Heemin mentions her professor won't be in the office today, so she'll pick Jimin up earlier. Jimin wonders if her boss has plans, and Heemin confirms that sometimes he does. Jimin asks if he can come along with her, catching her off guard with his request. She pauses, considering his request, then smiles and agrees. He tells Heemin that he wants to see how she works at the office. Heemin inquires about his school day, but Jimin mentions it's not a good day to go because his stomach hurts. Heemin jokes if it's because it's bring your dad to school day. She reassures him that even if dads are visiting today, it won't be much different, and he can just play with his friends like usual. Jimin protests, mentioning how their dad used to visit Heemin during her school days. Heemin looks at him sympathetically, feeling sorry for him. At the College of Natural Sciences, Jimin happily climbs the stairs with Heemin, advising him to be careful because there are a lot of steps. He insists he's fine, and she hopes nothing goes wrong. In Professor Seo's office, Jimin remarks how different it looks compared to their home or his school. He asks if Heemin's boss is tall, cool like the ones on TV, or scary. Confused, Heemin questions who he means, and Jimin mentions Seo Eun-hyuk. She chuckles, reminding him not to watch shows meant for adults. Jimin persists, asking if the professor is handsome like Eun-hyuk. Heemin hesitates, unsure, but mentions Professor Seo is kinder than Eun-hyuk. Jimin presses further, questioning if the professor is really that kind, and Heemin describes him as very kind and occasionally scary. Jimin is puzzled by this description, but their conversation is interrupted by a knock on the door. Heemin loudly asks if it's the professor at the door, but to her surprise, it's Miss Kim who enters instead. Miss Kim notices Jimin with Heemin and demands to know why he's there. Clearly upset, Heemin suggests they talk outside and hurriedly leads Miss Kim out, closing the door firmly behind them. Jimin, who had been hiding behind Heemin, cautiously steps out and asks if Miss Kim is angry. Heemin confirms this and tells him to wait inside the office for a while. Jimin agrees, pledging to guard the office while she handles the situation. It's won the road. Professor Seo and his friend, the doctor, are in the car. He's driving. His friend is not happy, wondering how special the food at the wedding is that no one thought of leaving to give him a ride back to the hospital. The professor replies that he's giving him a ride. His friend says he is, but his dark energy is suffocating him. He goes ahead to ask him about the person he was worried about, if he's feeling better about it a bit, and he replies that he's not sure about it. They get to the hospital. His friend alights from the car and tell him that he shouldn't just sit there doing nothing, that if he needs help, he should ask him, saying that he has more knowledge about stuffs like that than him. The professor replies that he's not sure about that. He asks him if he's sure he won't regret it. Arriving at school, he heads straight for his office. He remembers Heemin mentioning she'd be around over the weekend, and he's surprised he actually came in today. Thoughts of her linger in his mind, especially how their hands brushed when she offered to tidy up his table. He wonders why he can't stop thinking about her. Recalling his friend's question about regrets, he shrugs and figures at least he won't regret being at the office today. The real issue is how he feels. Turning the doorknob, he senses something familiar, a scent reminiscent of her fingertips. Opening the door, he's startled to hear a voice asking who he is. There stands Jimin, a small boy, in front of him. Jimin quickly stops him from entering, warning him it's the CEO's room. Professor Seo is taken aback by this unexpected revelation. He looks at Jimin, puzzled, and asks why he's here. Jimin explains he's waiting for Heemin, who went to the restroom and asked him to guard the door. Professor Seo nods slowly, still processing the situation. He wonders why Jimin would be here alone and if Heemin is with Seo Eun-hyuk. Jimin reassures him that Heemin is fine, and Professor Seo nods again, trying to piece together everything. He asks Jimin if he knows where Eun-hyuk is, and Jimin replies that he's at the company. Professor Seo steps inside and immediately asks where Jimin's parents are, offering to call them. Jimin responds solemnly that they can't answer because they don't have phones in heaven. The professor looks at Jimin, struck by how much he resembles Heemin. He asks if Heemin is Jimin's sister, surprised that Jimin knows her. Jimin confirms she's his sister, but he insists the professor can't touch things because the CEO is strict and imposing. Professor Seo chuckles and asks if that's what Heemin told him about her boss. Jimin remains secretive, calling it a secret. He then mentions that Heemin always says she can't live without Jimin, which triggers a memory for Professor Seo of hearing those words before. Curious, Professor Seo asks Jimin who Heemin loves more than anyone else, and Jimin proudly says it's him. The professor smiles warmly. Jimin asks why he's laughing, and Professor Seo apologizes for not introducing himself earlier. He straightens up and says his name is Seo Jihyeok, clarifying that he's not exactly the boss, but the owner of the office they're in. Outside the office, Miss Kim scolds Heemin for bringing her brother to Professor Seo's office, pointing out how much the professor dislikes interruptions, especially from an uncontrollable young boy. Heemin defends herself, explaining she prepared Jimin beforehand and had no other option. Mrs. Lim approaches from behind, noticing the argument in the corridor. She asks Miss Kim what's happening, but Miss Kim brushes her off dismissively. In the corridor, alone with Heemin, Ms. Lim mentions how many students have had their eyes on Professor Seo for a long time, implying that Heemin might be attracting unwanted attention. Heemin denies having any romantic feelings for the professor. Ms. Lim finds her stubbornness puzzling and advises her to take her little brother back before rumors start. Heemin agrees reluctantly. As Ms. Lim walks away, she compliments Heemin's parents for raising such a responsible sibling, unaware of Heemin's gloomy expression. At the office door, Heemin takes a deep breath, deciding to shake off her worries and put on a smile. She opens the door cheerfully, asking Jimin if he's been doing a good job guarding the room. To her surprise, Professor Seo is sitting inside with Jimin. He invites her in warmly, and Jimin excitedly shows her a drawing he made. Heemin gently scolds Jimin for drawing here. Professor Seo mentions he heard she asked Jimin to guard the room, praising him for doing a good job as instructed. He playfully tousles Jimin's hair, joking about Heemin bringing her brother to meet him. Heemin can't believe what's unfolding in front of her. She moves towards Jimin. Professor Seo asks him if he's done coloring, and he answers, addressing him as boss. His sister tells him not to address him as boss again. But her phone rings and Professor Seo wonders if people are still harassing her because of money. She picks it up and tells the person that she'll call her back. She walks towards the door to go outside. Professor Seo asks her to bring something for his little guest. She's surprised to hear that. The door opens, and Yoon Heemin enters, everyone surprised to see him, including Jimin. Professor Seo asks him if likes Yoon Heemin, and he says yes, that he wants to grow up and be a CEO just like him one day. Professor asks him what he's going to do if he becomes a CEO, and he replies that he'll go to the Father's Visitation Day class, and he'll go to the field events like everyone. He'll draw a picture and present it in front of the class and get the first prize, as everyone claps for him. Professor Seo looks silently at him as he speaks. He asks if by any chance today is that day. He replies yes, but explains that his sister says he could come to the office with her. The professor replies that he knows, since he's the one that tells her to bring him. Jimin tells him that when he becomes a CEO, he also wants to brag in front of Haejun, and he won't be able to say those things. He says to him again, and he'll buy some black clothes for Heemin, so that she'll be wearing it when she wants to meet him. Professor Seo asks him why black clothes, and he said, "It's evening, outside the college building." Heemin asks Professor Seo if he had an emergency because she didn't expect him here today. He said he did, that a friend of his needed a ride to the university hospital because he had an emergency surgery, so he decided to give him. Jimin comments that he's super kind, and Heemin concurs, saying that she had told him that already. They get to where they'll part ways. She tells him that they'll be going the other way. He offers to drop them off before going home, saying it's cold outside, and she has Jimin with her. But she declines, saying that they're not staying far, and also Jimin doesn't like to ride in cars very much. She asks Jimin, who agrees. They started walking away. Professor Seo stops them. He tells them that it's getting late, so he'll walk with them. He goes on saying everyone has things they don't like to do, things they don't like to see, or things they don't like to hear. He tells them that he doesn't like going on planes because they hurt his ears, so he rarely go on them. He asks Jimin if he thinks it's weird that he doesn't like going on planes, and he said no, saying that he can't ride cars. He tells the professor that things will get better for him soon. The both adults smiled. Jimin runs ahead, directing Professor Seo the way. Heemin tells him to be careful because their car's passing by. She shifts him to the other side of the road. Professor Seo tells her that she should be careful herself. She turns to him and tells him that it's dangerous for him. He replies that he's better off than the both of them. They get to a free area and asks if he can run there, because they aren't any cars. She agrees, but tells him to be careful. He runs ahead happily, left alone with Professor Seo. Heemin tries to explain the reason Jimin can't ride on cars, but he stops her, saying that she doesn't have to tell him if it would make her feel uncomfortable. Saying she doesn't have to force herself, she replies that she won't. She tells him that she tries to raise Jimin well, but still thinks it's not enough for him. She tells him that seeing how much Jimin likes him and listen to him, it made her feel a little bit weird. She says that she still wants the people Jimin meets from now on be people like Professor Seo. He tells her that it will be difficult because he tends only to speak the truth. He asks her how he will not like a sweet child like Jimin. He says that he looks more like her, saying that the last time she said that he looks like her, she was correct. He turns to Jimin and asks if he's still going to work on his own, offering that they should walk together. Jimin agrees and runs towards to him. He trips and nearly falls, but Professor Seo rushes and gets hold of him, asking him if he's okay. Jimin is amazed that he saved him, demonstrating how he opens his arm and catches him. Heemin thanks him for that, and he tells her that it's not a big deal because he have 3 younger brothers. Jimin is awe. They get to their house, and she thanks him. Jimin asks if he's not going inside with them, saying that he walked them home and also saved him. She tells him that it would have to be next time. He turns to Professor Seo, asks him if he can see him next time. He replies that yes, he can see him. Jimin tells him that he'll miss him, saying that he schools at Hankook University, Dreamtree Kindergarten, and he closes by 4 p.m. He asks if his sister can bring him to his office. He replies that he'll have to talk to the sister first. Heemin apologizes on behalf of Jimin, in case he have put him in an uncomfortable situation. Jimin asks if she's going to get scolded because of him. Professor Seo smiles and says that his sister is such an important person, and there's no way that would happen, saying that he still wonders where she has been the entire time and why she just showed up now. He tells him that without his sister, his work would be a mess, saying that he can't scold someone like her. He walks away while saying it. Heemin is surprised to hear that. Professor Seo gets home, only to see his 2 brothers there. Minhyuk says that he heard that he carried his friend to the hospital, and as he got there, a patient had an emergency, saying that if it weren't for him, the surgery wouldn't have been done early. Woohyuk suggests that more people need to know more about this side of him. Minhyuk tells him to calm down so that there won't be kicked out of the house. Jihyeok tells them to sit down. They're surprised that he didn't yell at them. The door opens and Eunhyuk walks in. He's surprised to see his other 2 brothers there. He asks why they didn't tell him they were coming. Minhyuk asks back why he didn't tell them that he was coming. Jihyeok calls them to other, asking if they have forgotten that they're in their house. He recalls what Jimin asks him, whether he catches his brother's top when they fall, just like he did for him. He wonders why he suddenly have the weird feeling of being responsible. He tells Eunhyuk to go and get alcohol. Minhyuk asks if that means they could sleep over, and he replies that if they want to. He drops his car key on the table, and Eunhyuk asks if he can take the car along. Woohyuk asks if he has ever seen Jihyeok lend out his car. Eunhyuk turns to him and they argue about him being old enough to ride a car. While still arguing, Jihyeok asks him how he said he is, and he replies 26. He gives him the car key to the surprise of everyone there. He wonders how much more mature he is. He thinks about Heemin. In school the next day, 3 students are walking in the corridor and talking about the professor. They're wondering what's happening with him. Because he smiled and replied their greetings earlier, one of them replies that he seems the same, but others won't agree, saying that he seems different from his usual self. The boy amongst them replies that they're just delusional. They tell him that he's only jealous. 2 teaching assistants, including Miss Lim, overheard them from behind. They enter into an office, and Miss Lim says that she can't believe that they're still acting like that. The other woman replies that freshman chemistry majors falling for Professor Seo is like a major requirement in the department. She replies that it's true because so many students have gone through that rite of passage. The other woman says that the one time he says hello back, he appears in their dream, and just looking at his signature on one's report would make one's heart beat faster. Just then, Miss Lim sees Professor Seo walking by. She runs to him and asks him when he got there, and he replies that he got there now. She asks if there's something he's looking for, and he didn't reply. The other lady scampers away. He looks at the notice board and sees a notice on the board. She tells him that Heemin wrote it. It's a notice for a midterm test, which was scribbled by Heemin in a fine handwriting, saying that she thinks more people would look at it that way. He looks at it and smiles at the little kitten drawn beneath the notification. He thinks that she and his brother are so alike, and they're a sort of siblings that has to draw on paper when they see it. She goes on to tell him that on Saturday, Heemin brought her little brother to his office for a bit. He asks what the problem is. She says that since Heemin is from a different department and was even recommended by the dean for the position, people have been giving her a bit of hard time, saying that on top of that she's working as his teaching assistant, so he cuts her short, asking what he has done. She looks at him and wonders if he really doesn't know, saying that they could have probably created a whole department with all the people who had a crush on him and eventually left in tears. She tells him she heard he scolded the other teaching assistants a few days ago in the library. She tells him that even something like that could start a rumor that would eventually come back to hurt Heemin in the end. She tells him still that since Heemin is working very hard, he should be nice to her. He tells her that he'll do what he thinks is best. She tells him that just in case there's a misunderstanding, Heemin says she really doesn't have feelings for him, so there's nothing for him to be worried about in that regard. He shuts the door and goes out. So everyone knows about that, he thought. In his office, he drinks the coffee offered to him. He complains that the coffee is too sweet, saying that he only puts 1 cube of sugar in his coffee. She tells him that she hasn't put in any sugar, saying that that's what she was about to do. She offers him the sugar. He wonders why the coffee tastes so sweet, even though there was no sugar. He looks at her. He calls her and asks how she likes being a teaching assistant so far. She replies that she loves it, that it's been fun so far. He sips again. It still tastes sweet. He looks at her as she arranges the book. He decides to forget it, that he'll just let it slide. The next day in Jimin's school, they are asked to draw. Soyeon asks him who he's going to draw, because their teacher had asked them to draw the father's visitation day. But she says she isn't going to draw that because it was too boring, that instead she'll draw who she saw on TV. He asks her what she's going to draw, and she replies, "So Eun-hyuk." He smiles. Hyejun comes to his desk and asks why he's drawing his dad, that he wasn't even present on that day. He replies that it's not his dad, saying that he's drawing a boss. Sujin cautions Hyejun, telling him not to scream at someone like that. When others are still drawing, he replies that Jimin is lying about who he's drawing. Seoyeon tells teacher that Jimin is drawing a boss, and she's also drawing Seo Eun-hyuk as a boss too. She looks at it and admires it. Hyejun reminds her that she said they're going up, give it out when they're done. He asks how Jimin is going to give it to Seo Eun-hyuk. They think about it. Later that day, in the house, Heemin is seated on the desk trying to work. She recalls what Professor Seo said about Jimin. She wonders what she's thinking about right now. Chiding herself to focus on her work, he remembers also when he said that Jimin is a lot like her. She tries to think about what he meant but concludes that he meant they're similar. She wonders why she keeps having all those thoughts. Jimin comes along and sees her drawing. He tells her that she's so good at drawing cats. She tells him that he's better than her in drawing. He agrees and asks her if her boss has not asked for him to go visit, saying that he had told him everything about him. His sister tells him that the professor is busy, that he has a lot of work to do. He tells her that he had promised. She asks him if he'll keep pouting like that. He tells her that he just wanted to give the professor something, a drawing, the one he drew in class. He says that their teacher told him to give it to him personally, that she also told them to give him a piece of chocolate with the drawing, saying that she gave them one piece each. She looks at him and gets the chocolate from him, telling him that she'll give the professor the chocolate, but can't give him the drawing. He asks why she can't give him the drawing too. It's the next day. In the professor's office, they sit other teaching assistants, including Mr. Park, who tells the professor how much work they've achieved because of the translation that's always made by Heemin. He also said that he has been wanting to take her out for a treat, to tell her thanks for everything, but schedule have always been making it hard. The professor asks him why he wants to treat Heemin to a meal. They're surprised by the way he interjected in the conversation, saying there was a reason he is sold ice rice cold. The guy replies that he's not supposed to even ask her out because she might have a boyfriend. At that point, Heemin comes inside and greets all of them. The guy welcomes her and volunteers to tell her what they are talking about, but the professor cuts him short and tells them to leave the office. He shares the job amongst them. He dismisses them. Outside, they wonder why the professor has been nagging. Heemin stands, and he turns and asks Heemin why she's standing. She brings out a bag that contains food, and she tells him that she brought food for him and the other teaching assistants. He's surprised that she also packed food for the others. She explains that she feels bad giving it to only him. He asks what's wrong with packing only for him, asking if she also borrowed money from them. She said no. He says that she's not doing charity work, so she doesn't need to make food for all others. She replies that she doesn't see making food for him as charity work either, but he still lends her money. He asks her if she thinks that she's the same as them, reminding her that she's his teaching assistant. They look at each other speechless. Professor Seo asks her why she's looking at him, asking if he has said something wrong, saying that she's his teaching assistant. She replies that it's just that he has done a lot for her compared to what she has been doing as a teaching assistant. He asks her if she thinks the amount of work she does is too little, saying that if she worries about that, then all she has to do is to pack another pair of chopsticks from now on. She's surprised to hear that. He has finished eating. She begins to close the window, saying that it's getting cold. The professor gulps and replies that the coldness came all of a sudden. He asked if she made sure Jimin dressed up warm enough today. He says that his coat looked a little bit thin that day. She tells him that she just bought a new coat for him to wear, and it was handpicked by Jimin himself. She tells him that the material they use in making clothes are good these days. So even though it looks thin, it is actually very warm. He asks her what about her, saying in his mind that she's the one that needs to dress warmer. He sips his coffee that has just been given to him. She remembers something and tells the professor that she has something to give him. He asks what she wants to give him, saying that she doesn't have to worry. She tells him that it's nothing big. She brings out the piece of chocolate and gives to him, telling him that Jimin got it from his teacher, saying he asked her to give it to him. He thinks about the boy. He asks her if Jimin is doing well these days, and she replies, yes. Then, as an afterthought, she begins to tell him something. A few hours later, still in his office, Professor Seo calls his brother, Eun-hyuk, telling him to help him do something. That's if he still wants to sleep in his place. In Jimin's class, the teacher asks them to talk about their drawing and who they gave it to. Hyejun, very eager to speak, was given the chance. He happily tells them that it's about the day their dad visited, saying that he gave the drawing and the chocolate to his dad. He says that his dad bought him new sneakers with a promise to take him out to an amusement park on Sunday. The teacher comments that he must be so excited. He turns to Jimin and mocks him, saying that he couldn't give his drawing to his sister's boss because he's a big fat liar. The teacher cautions him, telling him not to say that kind of words to a friend. There's murmuring outside the classroom, and they turn to see what's happening. The teacher asks what with all the commotion. She walks to gate door and is surprised to see So Eun-hyuk. He asks if it's the purple class. Hyejun screams in awe, calling him his name. He replies that he's not So Eun-hyuk because he's the boss. The children started hailing him. He walks to Jimin asking if he's the one. He said that he's here to get something from him. Saying that he heard he wanted to give him his drawing, he goes ahead to say that they held hands and walked together on Saturday. Jimin is still not convinced as he looks searchingly at the young man. He gives him the drawing, and Yoon Heemin says it is so cool and he can give anything to take it, saying that that's why he brought a cake to share with all the members of the purple class. He asks the teacher if it's okay by her. Jimin talks finally, telling him that he's not the boss. Yoon Heemin bends to him and whispers, telling him that he knows and he was sent by the real boss. Later, at the close of school, Heemin goes to carry Jimin. It's cold, and she comments that it feels as if it's winter already, and she can already see her breath. One girl happily runs to her mother and tells her that a boss came to the class today and they had cake. Jimin runs to her happily, telling her that the boss came to see them today. She wonders if he's talking about Professor Seo, but he was at school all day today. Then his teacher comes to greet her. Heemin asks how everything went today, and she replies that the boss came into the kindergarten today. There's still a lot to discover in this manhwa. Comment Professor Seo if you want us to continue this story. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, ciao.